Russian drones hit into Poland, and there was a lot of concern that as NATO issued its first Article 4th demonstration in quite a long time, when Poland shot down a number of Russian drones that veered into Polish airspace, there was much concern in the aftermath of, was this the potential opening round of World War III for the expansion of the war? Since that time, it seems that things have kind of calmed down a lot as we found out that these were unarmed drones, that they were not the kind of, they were not apparently the Garens that have been striking so much destruction inside Ukraine. So it's actually unclear actually what happened, but so far it hasn't ramped up anything yet. But it has illustrated some of the risks and the dangers of how the war could even accidentally be expanded.
I think there are three possibilities here. One is that the Russians actually targeted Poland. They were sending us a message, us meaning the West. That's one possibility. Another possibility is these drones just veered off course. And given the fact that the attack on the evening that the drones wandered into Poland, the attack inside of Ukraine was so huge, it is possible that a couple drones did wander into Polish airspace. And then the third possibility is that the Ukrainians jammed a number of those drones, sent them off course in a haywire kind of fashion, and they ended up going into Belarus and then into Poland, or going directly into Poland. It seems to me, Danny, that it's hard to believe that the Russians purposely attacked Poland with drones. It just doesn't make any sense at all. To me, the Russians have no interest in provoking NATO at this point in time. I think it's probably either those drones just naturally went off course on their own, or they were jammed and they went into Poland, or they went into Belarus and then into Poland. So I think it's either the second or third alternative. But as you pointed out, these were not armed drones. They didn't kill anybody. They didn't do significant damage by any means. But what's happening here, of course, is the West is blowing this up into a major event, all for the purpose of demonizing the Russians and mobilizing the West against Russia.
This incursion came as part of a over 400 air attack into Ukraine from the Russian side, which does continue on a near nightly attack, anywhere from 300 to 400 up to 800, as happened just a few days ago. And Ukraine simply doesn't have the capacity to shoot down everything that's coming in. And so every night there's lots and lots of destruction across the board throughout the depth of Ukraine. Meanwhile, as it always seems to be the case, it's along the front lines of where the real issues are. And just a few days ago, Alexander Syrsky, the commanding general for the Ukraine side, admitted that Russia has a threefold advantage on the front line, and in some areas it can prevail by 4 to 6 times.
Look at the various indicators that determine who wins in those battles up on the front line. There are three things that I look at. Number one is the overall ratio of forces on the two sides. And when General Syrsky, who is the Ukrainian commander, tells us that the Russians overall outnumber the Ukrainians 3-1, and at some critical points along the front line, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-1, you know they're really in deep trouble. Furthermore, there's all sorts of evidence coming from the Ukrainian side that they do not have enough forces to cover the front line. In other words, you have this huge front line that has to be covered by the Ukrainian army. And they have so few troops at this point in time that there are big gaps, there are open spaces in the front line. And when the Russians discover those front lines, they invariably make a penetration. So this is a huge problem. And then the third indicator that I look at has to do with what the percentage of available manpower is in the various brigades that are fighting on the Ukrainian side. And Putin has recently said, and I think there's no reason to doubt it, that the Ukrainian brigades are operating at about 50%, with about 50% of their available or their needed manpower, not their available manpower. They have about 50%. That's what's available of the needed manpower. These are brigades that are barely capable of functioning. when you've been attrited down to the point where your brigades only have 50% of the required manpower, you're in real trouble. So I would say that if you look at these three key indicators, the overall force ratio, the force to space ratios, and the available amount of manpower inside each brigade, the Ukrainians are in desperate straits.
Yeah, and if anybody doesn't say, oh, well, Vladimir Putin, of course, he's going to exaggerate everything and he's going to make it sound worse than it is. Well, don't take his word for it. Take the brigade commander of the 44th Brigade, who just, I believe this was released yesterday, on Ukrainian media. You see, he went public and talked about this. We don't have the people to cover every meter of the front. So that really validates exactly what you just said there. And you also got to imagine it seems pretty amazing to me that he's taken the risk of publicly saying this, because heretofore that's like been a kind of a no-no. You just don't talk openly about some of your weaknesses. But what does that tell you that he's willing to go public with this?
I think he's probably trying to send a signal to the higher echelons that they need more manpower and that they're in desperate straits and that something has to be done. And I think that would be the purpose of advertising this fact. And I would assume that the Russians know what these numbers look like anyway, and the Russians understand this problem that the Ukrainians have. So it's not like he's signaling classified information to the Russians. I think he's trying to tell people up top that we need more troops up on the front line. But the problem, as we know very well, is that the Ukrainians are incapable, for a variety of reasons, in raising the manpower that's necessary to replace those men who have been lost in the various brigades on the front line, and to just beef up the frontline forces to the point where they can cover the entire front, and they have something that approximates a 1-to-1 ratio with the Russians.
And even that might not be enough to slow it down, but they certainly want to get closer. The problem is, also according to Ukrainian sources here in the last week or so, is that they report that the Russian side continues to mobilize about 35,000 people per month, and they don't lose a fraction of that. Maybe somewhere around, by some estimates, 3,000 or 4,000 total that are killed and wounded per month on the Russian side, much lower than what is commonly ascribed to. But that tells you that the Russian military is growing, and so they don't have a problem plugging the gaps of the places they want to have this 6-to-1 advantage at the key areas, etc. And one has to wonder, how much longer can those dynamics exist without there being some kind of a break in the Ukraine line?
Yeah, there's two things I think going on with the Russians. Number one is that they are actually very good at raising large number of troops. It's the opposite of the situation that you see with the Ukrainians. But the other thing is the Russians employ their troops on the front line in very cautious ways. It's the reason that they have not captured a lot of territory. A lot of people in the West like to argue that the Russians are launching frontal attacks. It's like throwing troops into a meat grinder, and huge numbers of Russian soldiers are dying, many more than Ukrainian soldiers. This is simply not true. If you look at what's happening, and quite a few Ukrainian commanders comment on this, the Russians are actually remarkably cautious. They use small clusters of infantry to sort of feel out where the Ukrainian forces are, and then they use firepower of one sort or another. It could be artillery, it could be drones, it could be glide bombs, all to attack the infantry, the Ukrainian infantry that's been ferreted out by the Russian infantry. So the Russians are not suffering great casualties on the front lines. Of course, they're suffering some casualties. This is a war of attrition. Both sides have lots of firepower, and lots of people are going to die. But the Russian casualty levels are just not very high. And when you marry that to the fact that they're mobilizing huge numbers of troops, you come to realize that they have a large reserve of forces they can deploy at some point in time. They've not chosen to do that. But one has the sense that at some point the Russians are going to launch a massive offensive where they bring together many of those reserve forces that they've raised over the past 2 years and try to break through in a major way to the Dnieper River. Now, that might not happen. Who knows for sure what the Russians are thinking? But they, I think, have a significant advantage in manpower. You would expect them to take advantage of that at some point.
And you're speaking about the higher-ups. You said a second ago that you think maybe that 44th Brigade commander was making that public statement to signal to the higher-ups that, hey, we need more troops. Sersky also made the public comment that they're outgunned, outmanned 3-1 or 6-1, depending on where you're talking about there. Again, probably signaling to upper echelon that we don't have enough troops. So one would imagine that then Zelensky would be really focused on doing whatever he could to get more troops. But instead, he seems to be taking advantage of this opportunity with the drone strike or the veered off drones, whatever that went into Poland and were shot down, to get more money and to get more equipment, etc.
How to prevent the war from expanding, and how to stop Russian steps from escalating. Joint forces are absolutely enough for this. Today, there is a lot of international work on this, from all the leaders. I thank every leader who supported Poland, who supports Ukraine, and who understands the threat to the countries on the eastern flank. And that it is drones that Russia is now making the main tool for murder and destabilization. However, the missile threat does not decrease. Russia continues to build its military industry. We talked about all this with the leaders of Europe. Specifically, with the Prime Minister of Poland, Tusk, the Prime Minister of the UK, Starmer, the head of the Italian government, Meloni, and the NATO Secretary General, Rutte. It is important to continue to coordinate.
So he's acknowledging not just the manpower is growing on the Russian side. He brought into the situation that the Russian military industrial capacity continues to expand. Not even that it's already over, but that it's getting larger. It hasn't even plateaued yet. So why does he then think that this joint force, and I don't know what he's talking about joint force, because I haven't seen anybody else talking about sending troops in to fight with Ukraine. So I'm not sure where he's going with this.
Well, he's just trying to keep the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States at this point in time, in the fight. If it's Ukraine alone versus Russia, or Ukraine with minor support from the West against Russia, this war is over with very, very quickly. Ukraine absolutely needs Europe and the United States to support it in a major way. And the great problem that Zelensky and Ukraine more generally faces is that the United States is slowly but steadily breaking away from supporting Ukraine. And Trump is trying to shift the burden onto the Europeans. And Zelensky is surely smart enough to know that the Europeans can only do so much, and that the future of European support looks kind of bleak, because the economies in places like France, Britain, and Germany are anything but healthy. They're in real trouble, in fact, and we see this most clearly in the French case. So it's not clear that the Ukrainians can rely on European support for another year or two or three, much less American support. So what Zelensky is doing is waging an intense propaganda campaign that's designed to keep the West seriously committed to Ukraine. But if you go beyond that general set of points that I just made, and you sort of get down to the nitty gritty, and you ask, what exactly do they expect the West to give them? What do the Ukrainians expect from the West? And how is that going to influence events on the battlefield, which is what really matters? You don't see much evidence that the West can help them. We, first of all, can't provide manpower. And with regard to weaponry, we don't have the industrial bases in the various countries of the West. That includes the United States, to produce the weapons that Ukraine needs to redress the imbalance in weaponry between Ukraine on one side and Russia on the other side. And as you pointed out, at the same time, the Russian industrial base is pumping out weapons like crazy. The Russians have a huge inventory of weapons that the Ukrainians can't come close to matching. And the Ukrainians therefore need help from the West, but the West can't give them much help. And all of this just indicates that Ukraine may be good at waging the propaganda war or the information war, but in the final analysis, that's not what matters. What matters is what happens on the battlefield. And when you look at the situation up there, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, it's hard to see how Ukraine rescues the situation.
Mark Rutte seems to be on board, because he made a statement following this incursion of the drones into Poland that we need to be focused more on building up the military capacity. So it's almost as though, and I'd like your view on the backside of this, that Mark Rutte is going, let's just drag this war out as long as we can so that we can continue to maybe build up that capacity, because winning this is ultimately going to be in how many weapons we can make.
The Supreme Allied Commander will continue to actively manage our deterrence and defense posture along the entire eastern flank. Allies are resolved to defend every inch of Allied territory. We will closely monitor the situation along our eastern flank, our air defenses continually at the ready. This only reinforces the importance of NATO and the path to which allies agreed at our summit in The Hague earlier this year. We need to invest more in our defense, ramp up defense production, so we have what we need to deter and defend. And we need to continue to support Ukraine, whose security is interlinked with our own.
Why do you think that NATO and the elite in Europe are so keen to make a connection that their security is tied in with Ukraine? I understand that Zelensky said that from the beginning. He keeps saying, I'm fighting for you, I'm fighting for Europe, which I thought was always lunatic. But now it seems like more than Zelensky, you have the Europeans trying to say their security is linked to Ukraine. How can that be, or why should it be?
Well, it shouldn't be. The fact is that these people are so deeply invested in this war that to do a 180-degree turn and back off from supporting Ukraine or working hard to negotiate some sort of settlement which would end up looking like a Russian victory is untenable. They just can't bring themselves to do that. So they have concluded that if they double down, they can eventually rescue the situation. I think they're fully aware of the arguments that you and I make, which is that they can't fix this problem in the short term. But I think they believe that if they can hold on now and improve the amount of weaponry or the numbers of weapons and the quality of the weaponry that they produce and give to Ukraine, that will go a long way towards rescuing the situation. I think it's delusional. I'm sure you do as well. But it's quite clear that as time goes by, if anything, the Europeans, not the Americans, but the Europeans increase their commitment to Ukraine. And this, Danny, raises the very interesting question. If we're right about what's going to happen on the battlefield, and at some point in the not too distant future, the Ukrainian forces are going to crumble, at least on parts of the battlefield, and the Russians are going to end up winning some important victories. What are people in the West going to do? What are people like Mark Rutte going to do? You want to remember that they're so heavily invested in this war at this point, and they're continuing to double down, that you're now in a situation where if the West loses, if NATO loses, this will be a devastating blow. And are they just going to accept that fact? Are they just going to say, well, the Russians won? We gave it our best shot. It didn't work out, and we have to swallow this bitter pill. Is that likely to happen? I don't think so. I think the pressure to escalate in the West and to double down further if the Ukrainian forces begin to crumble will be enormous. And we will be in a very dangerous situation. I think that the bottom line here is that the longer this war has gone on, the greater the potential for escalation, one way or another.
So let me ask you something in terms of what Rutte is trying to get done there, because he keeps talking about we need to have this more investment and we need to raise defense spending to 5% GDP across the alliance and all that kind of stuff. There seems to be, to me, that there is economic pressure that would mitigate against that. And let me tell you what I mean. So when the war started and Russia made its initial invasion in February 2022, I think the evidence suggests that they thought that demonstration was going to coerce the Ukraine government into a quick deal that they didn't make in December that year. And when that didn't happen, they didn't have a plan B. They were not resourced to fight a long sustained war. And so they had to, batten down the hatches. And it took them the better part of a year and a half, maybe 2 years, to get their defense industrial base up to where it could produce what it's producing right now. But they weren't ready on that at the beginning. But because this was an existential fight for them, they did whatever it took to ramp it up. We aren't in an existential fight. Europe is not, their troops aren't dying. Their land is not being blown up. So there's not that pressure. And so it seems to me, especially at this point in the conflict, that even though the European side would want to ramp up to that level, it seems like the firms would have to say, okay, hang on, it'll take years to get to some of this place. And there's a lot of financing that would have to go into it and a lot of capital up front. And then what if the war's over before that thing even happens, or a year from now? Let's say it drags out that long. From an economic and business perspective, are you going to want to invest that much money into something you think that we're not going to need 2 million artillery shells per year production after the war's over? So why invest in something that can't pay back?
I agree. I mean, if you look at the situation in France and in Germany, and it's true in Britain as well, to support all this defense spending, it's quite clear you're going to have to cut social spending. And I think that's politically impossible to do. These are, welfare states, and people expect that they're going to be taken care of, the citizenry in these states, that is. I think the idea that you're going to be able to take money away from social programs and put it into defense is delusional. It's just not going to work, not over the long term. And furthermore, as you point out, even if they do that and they can sell it politically, the fact is that by the time those investments pay off and those countries are producing the necessary weaponry, this war will be over with. It's just not going to last that long. And therefore, I think that the West is in deep trouble. And just like you, don't understand why they haven't settled this one or moved to settle this one earlier.
We've talked about the industrial capacity. We talked about the manpower issue. Well, one of the other opportunities that the West is wanting to use to take advantage of this drone incursion to kind of cast new light on something is in the financial realm. And so we have Kaja Kallas on the diplomatic front saying, hey, I know, let's just bring enough sanctions pressure and that will do the trick.
Ukraine's bravery, backed up by international support, has already prevented Russia from achieving its military goals. But it's not enough. The only option we have is to pile more pressure on Russia, provide more support to Ukraine, and prepare for the day after. Honourable members, more pressure on Russia means more sanctions and continued work to address circumvention, including dismantling the Shadow Fleet. On sanctions, like I said, we are now working on the 19th package and collecting input from the member states.
Even in her comments there, it seems to be lost on her that we already have 18 packages that have never moved the dial any in changing Russian behavior, and somehow you think the 19th one will?
I don't know what to say. You want to remember that when this war started, one of the reasons that we basically pushed the Ukrainians to walk away from the Istanbul negotiations when it looked like you were going to settle the war in March, April of 2022 was because we thought we could defeat the Russians. And it was not so much on the battlefield, although we thought the Ukrainians would do very well on the battlefield. We thought that sanctions were what was going to be principally responsible for slaying the dragon, that we could put unprecedented sanctions on Russia and bring Russia to its knees. That did not work out at all. If anybody's been hurt economically as a result of this conflict in Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians and the Europeans, not the Russians. So we've tried sanctions, and as you point out, all those sanction packages have not worked, hardly at all. And now they're talking about more sanctions. But for everyone who studied this issue, it's quite clear that there's no magic bullet here. People were talking about, and still talk about, I guess, secondary sanctions. And this is where we can't sanction Russia directly. So what we do is, in effect, sanction those countries like China and India that are importing Russian oil. That's the secondary sanctions. Secondary in the sense that it's not the Russians you sanction, it's the Chinese and the Indians. Well, the Americans have figured out that you can't sanction the Chinese. You put secondary sanctions on them, they'll retaliate.
Is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent seeming to go in that exact direction?
President Trump, Vice President Vance had a very productive call with EU President Ursula von der Leyen on Friday. She followed up with a call with me, and we are talking about what can the two, EU and the US, do together. And we are prepared to increase pressure on Russia, but we need our European partners to follow us, because if the US and the EU do this together, we are in a race now between how long can the Ukrainian military hold up versus how long can the Russian economy hold up. And if the US and the EU can come in, do more sanctions, secondary tariffs on the countries that buy Russian oil, the Russian economy will be in full collapse, and that will bring President Putin to the table.
So as an international theorist, expert that you are, is it possible for US and Europe to bring that kind of pressure on India and China?
I don't think so. If it was, we would have done it already. Trump talked about secondary sanctions a long time ago. You want to remember that the reason we had the August 15th meeting in Alaska was because Trump was looking for a way to get out of the sanctions threat that he had levied on the Russians. Secondary sanctions were supposed to go on Russia, which meant you were going to sanction China and India. And Trump understood that that was the last thing he wanted to do. So he sent Witkoff scurrying off to Moscow to meet with Putin and to beg Putin to have a meeting. They didn't have that meeting on August 15th because the two sides had been working out an arrangement on how to settle this conflict. None of that had happened. There was no preparation for a meeting of that sort on August 15th. The meeting on August 15th, right, was set up as a way of avoiding putting secondary sanctions on Russia on August 8th, as Trump had promised. And one of the first things that Trump said after the August 15th meeting was that secondary sanctions were taken off the table. And the reason that they were taken off the table is that Trump understood that they wouldn't work. He couldn't put secondary sanctions on China because China could do things to the United States that would hurt us greatly. And he didn't want to put secondary sanctions on India, although he ended up slapping another 25% worth of tariffs on the Indians so that their tariff level is now up to 50%. But he doesn't want to go further than that with regard to India. In fact, I would bet that they're probably looking for a way to back off from those additional 25% worth of tariffs that they've put on the Indians.
Well,
So,
you know, I actually saw it yesterday, and I wish I had thought to bring this up, but on the Trump's Truth Social and on Modi's X account, both presidents featured a screenshot of the other president's comments that, hey, we're trying to find a way to this. I'm sure we're going to be able to. We still want to have friendly relations. So it looks like they're trying to make some progress on that, which would seem to make it incredibly unlikely that we would then be ready to level more sanctions either on India or China, because if India doesn't agree to stop buying Russian oil, and I don't think they even can agree to that, then we're going to find some other way out of this, and therefore that problem is not going to be solved of getting them to stop buying Russian oil.
Danny, the Indians have increased the amount of oil they're buying from the Russians. This has not worked. The 50% tariffs have not worked. And you can call the second 25% worth of tariffs on India secondary sanctions if you want. They've not worked. And we saw what happened at the recent SCO meeting in China, where the Indians, the Russians, and the Chinese were acting like bosom buddies. I mean, it just didn't work.
Right.
Trump understands that secondary sanctions is not a meaningful option. But what is he doing instead? He's asking the Europeans to put 100% secondary sanctions on Russia, which means 100% secondary sanctions on China and on India. He wants the Europeans to do that. Do you think the Europeans are foolish enough to do that? No, they're not. So we can have all this talk about the United States and Europe getting together and putting secondary sanctions on Russia, which again means China and India. But I find it hard to believe that we're going to do that. And if we do it, it's not going to work.
So do you think it's possible then that in light of that maybe Besant's comments from this Sunday aren't as detached from reality as they appear, but because he predicated it on Europe doing these things, that maybe Trump has laid in this situation to where, okay, well, if the Europeans aren't going to do it, we're not going to do it without them. And so we're not going to do it, because I can't even imagine that Europe is going, with their economic situation, is going to slap 100% tariffs on both India and China. Do you?
No, I mean, it's not going to happen. You see no movement in that direction. Right? What you get in the West is just a lot of empty talk. There's just all this talk about doing this and doing that, but nothing concrete ever comes out of it. We just continue to talk about all these different ploys for bringing Russia to its knees, for ending the war, for coercing the Russians, giving more weaponry, giving more money to the Ukrainians, putting greater sanctions on Russia. I mean, there's just no there. We have no levers. This one's going to be settled on the battlefield. And Ukraine's situation on the battlefield is dire. We went through the numbers. Okay, the question then is, what is the West going to do to rectify that situation? Do you hear these people talking about how they can rectify this great imbalance that you have on the battlefield? No, they don't talk about that. And if you don't talk about that and you don't provide some sort of workable solution for rectifying the imbalance of power on the front lines, this is just all beside the point.
Yeah, and then that is going to just lead to the very unpleasant circumstances that you described earlier in this episode of what are we going to do when the inevitable happens and the battlefield plays out the way the numbers indicate they will, and we have to deal with the loss. And I guess we'll just punt that off until some other day and figure it out and find some other way to spin it, I guess, because we seem to be setting up that very condition.
Well, I think we're kicking the can down the road. The other thing, Danny, I think you want to keep your eye on is the fact that Trump has to make sure that when Ukraine falls, that when the Ukrainian army crumbles and the Russians are clear winners, that he can't be blamed for failing to support Ukraine. So what Trump is trying to do is to support Ukraine, mainly at a rhetorical level, and he's trying to push as much of the burden as possible on the Europeans. But he's not pulling out of the fight, which is why you can make a case that he doesn't look that different than Joe Biden. But I think a lot of this just has to do with the fact, not that he thinks that the Ukrainians can rescue the situation, but that he has to protect himself so that he doesn't end up looking the way Joe Biden did when Afghanistan went down.